Last day of the 2022 National Conference on Ending Homelessness. I think we see we're thinned out a little bit. I think we're probably seeing the impact of the strikes that have started today in Ontario, but we're going to make sure that folks have access to the online program as well if they needed to be home. So thank you all for coming. We're going to get started with our program, and I'd like to start by inviting Will Campbell and Jocelyn Pabram up to begin with a prayer.
Bonjour. I'd like to begin to start to say good morning, my relatives. I'd like to acknowledge the territory that we're on Treaty 13, unceded territory of the Mississauga, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and our Wendat. I'd like to begin with maybe a bit of storytelling before we get into our prayer. But before I start, I also like to acknowledge the spirit name that was given to me. The name that's been given to me by my mother and father is Jocelyn, but the name that's been given to me by the grandfathers and grandmothers is Wabishki, Migizi, Nizminjikash, Maigan, Indudun. So what I just said is basically I'm White Eagle Clan, and I'm White Eagle Dances, and I'm from the Wolf Clan. I'd like to give thanks for all of you who are here today, but especially our knowledge keepers and our elders. We try to really work together to make this journey that you guys have decided to come forward in learning, but to be in spirit together as we move forward. They say you never know a person till you know their stories, and especially the ones that we know are homeless. You cannot build peace or harmony till you see yourself inside another. A city will never reach its full potential till it shares its stories, all stories. To leave a story untold is to leave behind your ancestors, to deny your inheritance, and to disconnect your spirit of place. We know that all across Canada, and I know a lot of you come from all over, but the cities were built on and over the gathering places of our Indigenous nations, our First Nations people. In Toronto, it was considered the meeting place. Ottawa, a trading place. Manitoba means Manitou, means the place where the spirit resides. In Edmonton, it was actually Manto, which with spirit and energy of that great mystery. So the reason I bring this forward to do is that our First Nations people always had home, the interconnectedness of being on that land. And we say always, all of my relations, very interconnected with everything. And they still have home. This is their land. What they don't have is houses, which is why we gather to find solutions for our homeless. I've been part of a grandmother's council that started through our Sundance, where our vision, Connie, our late strong earth woman, had at the Sundance, is to have a grandmother's council. The importance of this grandmother council, what she saw through that vision, is that the grandmothers had to gather the Kukums and start taking their role in the community Most of our Indigenous people were matriarchal, and they had to take their place in that community, but also in the Sundance community, that we had the hierarchy of understanding that the councils of grandmothers would give guidance to our leaders, the Sundance chiefs. But the reason that she had seen is that we needed to gather the children to bring them back home. Our children are lost. They're lost on the street with no home, and they need that protection. Our children are lost in gangs, in drug addictions. Our children are lost in sexual exploitation that's happening. So what the grandmothers started doing was starting to walk from an area in Winnipeg at what we call the Forks. And they would walk and gather and go walk in front of the Parliament of the government. And what happened is that over the years brought grandmothers from across Canada to walk in their communities to request to have their children back. That the children would no longer be in child welfare care, that they would come back home to healthy families. And that the men would be our protectors and our providers. And we can all do that together. I found this a hard journey at this conference, because I was also carrying many of those who came forward as they were smudging. I could sense their pain. I could sense their goodness in their heart. And that's why today I went around with Mark, who was smudging with the sage, to also have sweetgrass for kindness, to be kind to ourselves, to give that strength back to ourselves, to do self-care, but also to have that kindness for everyone, that as we walk in this way, that we always speak in a kind and gentle way. I'm going to pass over to our elder, Will Campbell from Edmonton, to now say the prayer to start our day.
Yes, I'd also like to acknowledge the givers of life and to thank you all for, sharing these last few days with us and together, and to remember that solutions lie in relationships and in partnerships. And the solution for what we're facing today lies in each of us. And together that we can make these changes that's going to prepare a place for the children of the future. So with that, I'd like to say the prayer and acknowledge each and every one of you. How Shina Tanka Eoham Leokshila Tanka Chikala Tanka Ushte. Wakatonka Tukaya Che Waki Elo Mitakawe Wanatacha Tukaya Che Waki Elo. Great Spirit, come in a humble way today to ask for prayers of health and prayers of happiness for each and every one of us. To give thanks to the old ones for their wisdom and their direction. To say a prayer for the little ones and the ones that are still to come, that we prepare a place of good health and happiness for them. I say a prayer for those that are in hospitals that are sick and having a hard time, that you take their pain, their hurt, their sickness, and to put it where it won't hurt them anymore. I give Prayers to those that are without food and shelter today, to the families that are suffering, and the children, most of all, that you help them in a good way. I pray for my brothers and sisters who are in the prisons and institutions across this country. I pray that they find their way back to this sacred place and that we can pray together again. I give thanks to Mother Earth, for everything upon her comes from her. And I give thanks to each and every one of you in a good way for your health and happiness and your loved ones. Aho mitakias. Thank you.
Thank you, Will, and Jocelyn, thank you for sharing, and thank you for your wisdom, and thank you for your blessing. It's now my pleasure to introduce Michael Braithwaite. He is the CEO of Blue Door in York, and is the co-host of the On the Way Home podcast. I'd like to invite him up to introduce our keynote this morning.
Good morning, everyone. I see that although many of us are far removed from high school, the practice of not sitting at the front lives on. It is so great to be here, to be back in person, to see a lot of familiar faces, meet some new people as well. I can tell you this, too, 2 years ago, this suit fit a lot better. I think I'm one cough away from blowing the pants out. So my name is Michael Braithwaite, and I have the great pleasure of being the CEO of Blue Door, where I work with an amazing team of people doing impactful, life-changing work. Many, I don't know if they made it here this morning. Blue Door? Yeah? No. Sadly, no. I think they were in big discussions last night, so they must be tired. But working at Blue Door. But on the side, too, I am the host of On the Way Home, a podcast that looks to create awareness and education in our sector. So when we launched Away Home, Tim said to me, we need to go out and get the brightest, the most passionate, the best of the best in housing, homelessness, health, poverty reduction. And when they weren't available, we came to you. All kidding aside, with the exception of Tim Richter, we have had amazing, passionate, brilliant guests on the podcast. Check it out at onthewayhome.ca. They share their stories. We've had lived experts on there, sharing their stories, shaping how we move forward. We have people talking about the challenges, but the solutions, people doing really, really cool stuff across the world that is changing things, right? And that's the beauty of doing this podcast virtually. Australia, Norway, Finland, the States, and of course the brilliant people across Canada can contribute to it. So take a listen. But also today, if you're doing something cool, innovative, you have a challenge, you have new research that you want to get out there and share that others can benefit from, reach out to me at michael.b@bluedoor.ca or go to the On the Way Home table outside there. Love to have you on the show. Check it out. It's everywhere you find podcasts. It's on the website. You can link to it through the CAEH website. Awareness and education is big. Building partnerships, relationships, that's huge. That's how we're going to move forward in preventing and ending homelessness. So check that out. It is my honor today to introduce Professor Loretta Ross. So Loretta is an award-winning, internationally recognized expert on racism and racial justice, women's rights, and human rights. Her work emphasizes the intersectionality of social justice issues and how intersectionality can fuel transformation. Loretta appears regularly on major media outlets about the issues of our day. She was recently featured in a New York Times piece, "What if instead of calling people out, We called people in. She has led a TED Talk, which has had almost 2 million views to date. She is a visiting associate professor at Smith College, teaching courses on topics including white supremacy, race and culture in America, and human rights. Loretta has co-written 3 books on reproductive justice, including Undivided Rights, Women of Color Organized for Reproductive Justice, and is the winner of an Outstanding Book Award by the Gustavus Myers Center for the Study of Bigotry and Human Rights. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Ross.
Things wrong. Can you hear me now? I hope my mic is working.
You're good.
Okay, I'm good. Well, it's quite an honor to be with you. I started studying the topic of the call-out culture about 7 years ago when I got on social media and suddenly, belatedly, discovered how incredibly mean people were to each other. And once I started studying the topic, I started processing my nearly 50 years in doing human rights work and social justice activism, and realized that I had a body of experiences that may lend themselves to the discussion of the call-out culture. I am a rape and incest survivor who helped start a program called Prisoners Against Rape that talked to and taught Black feminist theory to men who had been convicted of raping and murdering women. Obviously, that did not feel safe for me to do that work, but it became necessary if we were going to figure out how to stop men from raping women. 20 years later, I monitored hate groups at the Center for Democratic Renewal, formerly the National Anti-Klan Network. Excuse me. And my job there was to help deprogram people excuse me, who have been caught up in the white supremacist movement. And these were not people that I wanted to bring home for beer or coffee. But I found that once I got to know them, I couldn't hate them anymore. And so when I heard about the call-out culture, I decided that if I had learned to talk to rapists, to talk to ex-Klansmen and ex-Nazis, and to talk to all my problematic allies in the women's movement, because if you're a Black feminist, by definition, everybody is your problematic ally, that I had something to contribute to this conversation. Now, the reason I'm so passionate about the call-out culture and changing it into a calling-in culture is because I believe that the forces who are opposed to human rights are mistakenly thinking that they're fighting us, the human rights movement. But I actually think they're wrong. We're fighting them, but they're not fighting us. What they're truly fighting is truth, because lies are their only currency. It's the only register they can use. They're fighting evidence, trying to deny evidence of human rights violations like, genocide and stolen children and sterilization abuse and racial violence and all of this stuff. They're trying to deny and fight history as if they can just forbid people learning about history. It's efficient to make sure that history is not taught, told, but you can't bury history indefinitely. It's going to come out anyway. And most of all, I think they're fighting time. And no matter how desperately they wish to do so, they simply cannot push us back into the 19th century as they wish to. So since we have truth, evidence, history, and time on our side, we have a winning hand. And no matter how badly we do our work, we probably will win. And the reason that I hedge my bet is that I'm concerned that the call out culture within those of us who are fighting for human rights may snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, because we are cannibalizing each other with our call out tendencies. We are overstating harm when in fact we're just discussing differences. We are making unreasonable claims for safe space in the human rights movement. And the reason I call those claims unreasonable is because the purpose of the human rights movement is to fight oppression. And we are facing some of the most ruthless forces in the world. So if being oppressed is not safe, why would we expect that fighting oppression against these ruthless forces is going to be safe, not challenge us, not make us feel compelled to work with people who are different than us? Because unfortunately, a lot of the call out culture, as I've analyzed, is driven by the need for people to see the human rights movement as their personal therapy space, where they're going to get healed, not challenged, not be discommoded, not be held accountable for the harm that they do and the growth they still need to engage in. So in that vein, I have created something that I think will help us in challenging this call out culture. And I do so from the perspective as a human rights activist. I think the human rights framework is our connective tissue to build a movement. I believe that we need to have an indigenous rights wing of the human rights movement, coupled with a feminist like me in the women's rights wing of the human rights movement, but I care about racial justice. So I should also be part of the civil rights wing. I'm disabled. So of course I care about disability rights and environmental justice and fighting against homophobia, transphobia, for immigrant rights, refugee rights, all of those things. And if we see ourselves as part of the same human rights movement, even as we focus on different sectors of it, then we'll quickly realize that we cannot do our work in contradictory ways. In other words, I can't be a women's rights activist in a racist way. I can't be a trans rights activist in a misogynist way. I can't fight for civil rights while I'm being xenophobic against immigrants. I can't fight for environmental justice while ignoring the sovereignty claims of indigenous people. All of these approaches are trying to do the right thing, but we're going about it the wrong way. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm going to intensely focus, at least for the foreseeable future, on helping us build a calling in culture, because that's my theory of change. It's my strategy for building this human rights movement for the 21st century. And it requires me to help people understand how we have to be committed to the complexities of human development, have a very clear analysis of power, violence, harm, and what's at stake, so that we don't treat problematic allies as enemies. And we need to model what is possible when we center our vision of the world that we are fighting for, because it's not enough just to define yourself by what you're fighting against. It's very important to understand that you have to have a vision of what would happen if you succeed. In service of this calling in vision I created something called the 5C continuum. It consists of calling out, canceling, calling in, calling on, and calling it off. Now, we're all familiar with what calling out is. Calling out is publicly shaming and blaming someone for something you think they've done wrong, for which you want to hold them accountable. Now, the key word in that sentence is publicly blaming and shaming them. The problem with this strategy is that when you publicly humiliate someone, instead of inviting them into a conversation, you've invited them into a fight. Because everyone who's human is normally going to feel like you put them on the spot. You've chosen this method of getting their attention, not to help them grow, but to help them actually be embarrassed, put on the spot. If you think it's a strategy for making people change, it generally is not, because they generally double down, get defensive, get angry, counterattack. They do a whole lot of other things than accept an invitation to grow, generally speaking. Now, the ultimate calling out is canceling somebody. Not only do you want them to hold them accountable for something you think that they've done wrong, but you want them to pay a severe penalty for it, like losing their jobs or losing their reputation or at least their platform. You want to sentence them to social exile. Now, one of the contradictions of that approach, particularly by a human rights movement, is that we're replicating the tactics of the prison industrial complex within our own movement, because silencing people, exiling them, socially forgetting about them, hoping that you never pay any more attention to their needs, their wants, their words. That's what prisons do. And so we have to face the contradiction of trying to use the techniques of the prison industrial complex within our own movement. I think, in the words of Audre Lorde, it's a master's tools thing. You cannot use the master's tools to tear down the master's house. Now, calling in is another choice that we have. I don't want to portray it as a binary between calling out or calling in, because it's more complicated than that. Calling in is an accountability process. But instead of using anger, blaming, and shaming as a way of pursuing accountability, one chooses to use love and respect and grace. I believe that if we use love, respect, and grace as a way of having these challenging conversations with each other, we are more likely to get the results that we want. Because, as Maya Angelou very famously said, people may forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. So if you can make people feel heard, respected, forgiven for mistakes like you would want to be forgiven for mistakes, then you have a better chance of getting them to self-reflect on what they've done that you think they need to change. And you have a better chance of getting them to align their inner goodness with the words that come out of their mouths, because they're doing it from a place of wanting to participate in this conversation with you. The fourth C of the continuum is called calling on. This is when you don't want to make an emotional or investment into someone else's growth. You don't want to call them in, or you don't want to call them out, because both of those options require you giving them your time and attention. So calling on is that intermediate strategy where you simply are requesting that people do better. So instead of jumping down somebody's throat when they say something, or even trying to do a calling in strategy, you can just simply say, I can't believe you said that. I need you to do better. Or one of my favorite tactics is to just say, I beg your pardon. and then I wait. And generally in that pregnant pause, people will start reviewing their words and quite frequently will walk them back. So calling on is a great strategy to use with people that you know, people that you are related to or in relationship with, because when you use it with people you know or in relationship with, you probably have more than enough information about their inner personality, their inner goodness. And with that, you can actually ask them, I know you're a good person. Help me understand how I can understand how good you are in relationship to the words that just came out of your mouth. This is calling on them to self-assess how they want to present to you as a friend or a relative or to a work colleague. And the fifth C, calling it off, is something I don't think we use enough because it's a strategy of disengagement. Whether it's in real life or online, you have a choice about whether you're going to spend your time in unproductive conversations with people. And you can call it off permanently or you can call it off temporarily. Because the point is that you really only want to focus your time on people who are operating in good faith, people who are earnestly trying to arrive at common understandings with each other, who really are going to respect your humanity like you're trying to respect theirs. And so we need to learn how to call it off and more productively spend our time with people we should be calling in. So it's calling in is an ongoing practice of giving each other grace. We ask questions, we assume best intention, and most importantly, we strive for excellence and not perfection. We want to learn how to be in community with each other, with people with different ideas. One of my most repeated self-made cliches is that when many different people think many different thoughts and they move in the same direction, that's a movement. But when many different people think the same thought and they move in the same direction, that's a cult. And we are not building the human rights cult. So really check yourself to see if your approach is building unity or building dissension. Because if you're convinced that you're the smartest person in the room, you figured everything out, and if everybody would just listen to you, things would be great. You may be more devoted to building a cult of personality than a power base with which to challenge human rights violations and oppression. Now, I don't want to give the impression that I don't think call-outs are necessary. No, that's absolutely an option that we need. As a matter of fact, calling people out is what the human rights movement does. That's our most effective and well-known tactic. But what people don't understand about the strategic uses of call-outs is that it's our tactic of last resort, not our tactic of first resort. Before we call somebody out, we tend to try to talk to them first, give them a chance to change, give them a chance to do better, try to give them information on the harm that they're causing, all of these things before we get to a public blaming and shaming campaign. The problem with the call-out culture today within the progressive movement is that we don't want to take all the time investing in relationships and conversations that those other steps require. We just want a shortcut to the call-out because we're trying to do the right thing, but we're doing it the wrong way. But there are appropriate uses of call-out. When you want to address power disparities, when people with the power to harm people intentionally make themselves inaccessible to you, have been impervious to previous attempts to talk to them, to hold them accountable. You can appropriately use call-outs to avoid increasing harm. Maybe the person is just reckless with their power and how they harm people. And you can use call outs to find others who are experiencing similar harm and build community with these other people by spreading information through the call out culture. The call out also helps to identify those hidden or unnamed sites of harm or those structures of privileges that haven't been attended to. And often this is done by lifting up the voices of those who have been historically silenced. And of course, call outs are useful for releasing pent up outrage. And there are times when public shaming works. But here in the United States, since the election of Donald Trump, we've encountered a political party that is essentially shameless. They are right now laughing because the Canadian citizen beat an 82-year-old man in the head with a hammer. And they think that's just political sport. So shamelessness, shaming some people simply doesn't work. But mostly we inappropriately use call outs because we tend to criticize other people's social justice practices while not being critical of our own. And we weaponize our knowledge against people. We actually start condescending to and talking down to people because we think we have some special knowledge that they don't have. And so we end up not taking their concerns as seriously as we take our own. I'm developing a cold. And we tend to be dismissive of people that we don't think who are woke enough, as if when somebody learns something is a testament to their moral character. There's a lot of people using social activism to boost their ego or their standing in the community, getting into the woke competition. But I do say that the fact that you think you're in a woke competition proves to me, a seasoned activist, that you're not nearly as woke as you think you are, because everybody is needed to build this human rights movement to end oppression. And a lot of call out is driven by people convinced that we have to have politically pure opinions that perfectly align with each other. And if we don't have that perfect alignment, then we start shaming and ideologically bullying people for not being in agreement with us. And I think that call outs are driven when people select targets because it's safer to attack them because of their proximity to you than to confront the actual threats. And so people kind of do the sizing up thing like, okay, I can call you out for what I think is your racism or your toxicity because I know you won't punch back. As opposed to, let's go after the actual Nazis, let's go after the actual racists, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're going to rethink calling out. We've got to avoid this us versus them mentality and be clear about our motives for even calling people in or calling them out. Are you ready to contribute to their growth? Have your own consciousness expanded? Don't sabotage your own strategy of building a movement with the call out culture, because you have to envision what outcomes you want and you have to collaborate with people. And of course, this requires avoiding shaming and ousting as punishment because you value the relationships that we have to build in this movement. And so that's really, really important. Now, if we're going to transform calling out tendencies into calling in practices, we need to, for example, stop demonizing people, turn the other person into your enemy and resorting into personal attacks or insults on their character, their intelligence, their value, their political perspectives. Instead, depersonalize it. Acknowledge that the other person's position is important to them and how they might have that position based on their lived experiences that are going to be different from your lived experiences. But stay focused on the content of what they're saying, not who they are. Don't use identity essentialism to say, well, because you're X, I'm not surprised you're saying that kind of thing. I think one of our other calling out tendencies is to want to defend ourselves, where we become even more entrenched in our perspectives and insist on the primacy of our view. I know this, you do not. And that requires us to de-escalate, slow the conversation down and affirm that you are hearing what the other person is saying, even if you don't agree with what they're saying. And then sometimes we want to dictate, we want to prioritize our perspective of the conflict and to the exclusion of how other people are experiencing it. A lot of people create a call out conflict and they're oblivious to the fact that they may be silencing everybody else in the room because they simply don't care. And instead we can describe, what we are feeling, what we are learning, what we are experiencing without shutting other people down. We can provide details and ask questions to enhance those details to help people learn our perspectives and slow down to learn theirs. A lot of call outs are also used to distract people. You throw curveballs or false equivalences or red herring that aren't necessarily relevant, but they do allow the person doing the call out to control the conversation. And instead, we can discuss and we can engage in the ideas or information being brought to your attention and be rigorous about staying on topic, identifying, well, this whataboutism or false equivalency you're using is distracting us from what we're supposed to actually be talking about. And then a lot of people use call outs to deflect. They don't want to take any responsibility for what they're doing, and they want to shift blame to others and cover their roles in the conflict. And this allows us to instead decide, agree on what comes next or agree to disagree. Take responsibility for the status of the conflict and its outcome. And so if you're going to do calling in is actually a call out done with radical love. So a calling in is a calling out. It's just that you're using love, grace, and respect instead of anger, blaming, and shaming. And you do this because you're investing in others in others as members of the human rights movement. It's not an identity-based practice, but an opportunity for everyone to self-reflect, apologize, repair, and change behavior. It's very important to not concretize your identity as a victim, overstate the harm, and then use that disempowered victim identity to weaponize your hurt against other people. Because we've all been hurt by, white supremacy, neoliberal capitalism, settler colonialism, and all that stuff. And so we're not in the oppression Olympics here. We have to remember the bigger picture. We have to encourage a spirit of inquiry and curiosity, and particularly radical generosity to each other. We've got to learn and use active, loving listening practices and being grateful for a chance to be together. And mostly, calling in is what you do for yourself. You're not doing it because you think you have the magic words to change somebody else. Those magic words don't exist, because if they did, couples wouldn't fight, colleagues wouldn't fight, families wouldn't fight. We don't have those magic words, but we do have the capacity to be intentional about how we present ourselves to the world. And so calling in like forgiveness is something that you do for yourself, not something you do for others, because it's a harm reduction strategy. It's a strategy for reclaiming your dignity and not let what happened to you define who you are. because it allows us to contribute to the human rights movement by finding our common ground and honoring our differences and seeing how those differences are our strengths, not our weaknesses. And it supports us in maintaining our integrity in very difficult situations. It encourages us to keep the focus on the bigger picture and our shared vision. And it keeps us from misdirecting our anger towards others and getting burnt out from disappointing exchanges when people don't magically change for us. And it reminds us that each of us are entitled to being complicated human beings who do have the capacity to change and grow. And it helps us most particularly avoid being distracted by divide and conquer strategy. I'm going to close by mentioning some things that I see how call outs affect our social justice workplaces, because I see a lot of call out culture destroying, imploding social justice organizations from within. And part of this is because almost nobody offers workshops for managers on how to treat employees better, or to take care of them, how to meet their needs, and how to make them feel human and heard. And yet at the same time, the workforce is younger, queer, more female, more intersexual, and not using the previous workplace social contract rules of loyalty to a company or a paycheck, because these employees are demanding respect, demanding to be heard, demanding to be appreciated. And so, generally speaking, when this call out happens in your company or in your organization or in your movement, I do recommend 3 steps for handling it. That first of all, you can thank the people, which sounds counterintuitive, but listen to me. What that person has called you in or out, whether they've done it in an in or out way, what they've done is gifted you with their time and attention. They noticed you. So you can sincerely thank them for that time and attention. The second step is to acknowledge that they've been heard and that you will consider what they've said within your own time frame. Acknowledging that somebody has been heard is not the same as agreeing with them, but people do want to know that you heard them. And then the third step is to turn a call out into a call in, because you can do that by asking how they're doing and why they chose to approach you in such a public way. Often they see the call out as their only choice because they may have tried to draw attention to an issue in other ways that was not heard or taken seriously. And so we end up with these generational and intersectional divides, making managing organizations more difficult. A lot of times managers are telling me that they're spending 90 to 95% of their time on internal meetings as opposed to the external threats that they're supposed to be working on. The workers at these organizations feel that they must use their social justice passion to disrupt the status quo in the system, but they get frustrated over their inability to address these external threats. And sometimes that frustration means that they will focus on internal issues. They say, well, of course, I can't change white supremacy and neoliberal capitalism, but I can certainly change who my manager is, kind of thing. And often it's even not about particular leaders, but the failures of the system, because the system is not designed to build the collective power of everyone. And actually, sometimes tearing each other down is rewarded within our social justice organizations. There's a lot of job precarity, vulnerability in our positions, and sometimes these issues are masked or disguised as diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, but they're far more systemic than that. And so sometimes normal workplace grievances are smuggled in, kind of like work-life balance or racial and gender diversity or whatever. And many workers feel like their moral commitment to the job is exploited by the management, and that the managers often perceive staff as ignoring major external or internal challenges facing the organizations. And the employees believe that social justice or human rights organizations should meet all of their needs, which is not the case. I mean, we in social justice movements, we're paid to serve people. We're paid to fight oppression while most people just have to endure it. The purpose of the organization is not to make us feel safe and all of that, but we have that emotional need for that. And so this even happens when I see a lot of many leaders of color, many trans leaders, many queer leaders attacked, because they will then be accused of being insensitive to the very marginalized communities that they're represented, often by woke employees eager to prove that they're more woke than their bosses, kind of thing. And it becomes a lose-lose situation for organizations, because if the situation that the accusations referred to are investigated and not turning out like the aggrieved employee wants, then they claim that the investigation was rigged and papered over injustices. But if an investigation is not launched, then people will be accused of ignoring the problem. And so this leaves the staff dissatisfied, claiming a cover-up, feeling invalidated, and it hampers the organization's ability to function. And then it takes place amidst wanting to hide from the public that these accusations of toxicity, mistreatment, and stuff are going on within the organization, because then it feels like you're loading bullets into your opponent's gun. And the basic problem is that there's no theory of change guiding the organization, or not, people are aware of it to assist in implementing it. And so what we need to do is make sure our organizations have a substantive theory of change, incorporate internal and external challenges in everybody's knowledge base who's there. You may need to do a substantive organizational audit with interviews with stakeholders to find out what's going on. But this needed to be guided by giving each other the benefit of the doubt. Call yourself in before you call yourself out. Understand that you're not doing it perfectly, and neither is anyone else. And that requires practicing self-forgiveness as a harm reduction strength. Learn about these calling in techniques, learn how to do better threat assessments, dial back the anger at people, be outraged against injustices, not people. And managers need to learn how to strategically use our vulnerability. Don't be afraid to show our pain and our challenges, and really accept that it's predictable that you're going to frequently work in settings of racial or gender illiteracy that's going to produce endless microaggressions. So stop being surprised by the obvious and learn that call outs are about the other person. And frequently this can actually provide you with useful information, such as Slack or through Twitter, that instead you might have to pay a consultant thousands of dollars to get. And so I'm going to shut up there, stop the share, and save time for Q&A. And thank y'all for listening to me.
Wow. So many pearls of wisdom in there, so many calls to action. Let's give one more time, some radical love for Dr.
Ever doing IT, I just lost the sound of the
So
audience.
we do have time for
Okay,
a few
thank you.
questions, and what we'll do is, if you see our two people on the sides here waving, they're not just waving, they have a mic in their hands there. So if you have a question, put up your hand, they will find you. Please identify yourself, ask your question, we'll come over to you. We'll go from side to side. Those who are attending virtually, please put your questions in the chat. We are going to start with one from our virtual audience. And Dr. Ross is, how do you deal with problematic allies who insist on continuing to call out people publicly?
I start with asking, what is it achieving for them? How is it benefiting you to make the world crueler than it needs to be? Is that the impact you really want? And how well is that working for you? Is it making you happier? Is it making you more peace? Yeah. I mean, I'm not even talking about the impact on the other person, because the way you call people out as a reflection more on you than them. It's like the way gossip works. If you are a gossiper about other people, the person you're talking to thinks you got the impaired morality, not the other person. And so, but instead of doing an attack on them, I just ask them to reflect, how well is this working for you? And do you think you have other choices here that you need to consider?
Thank you. Well said. Well said. I think, do we have a question over here? Perfect. Thank you. Nope. No. You want to come up here? Are you okay? Come on up here. This is working. All right, all right. Give a warm welcome. It's probably what he didn't want to do, but come on up.
This wasn't the plan. Dr. Ross, where do you find the moral and spiritual resources for radical love, respect, and generosity?
Descendants of kidnapped Africans. And so the wisdom from my ancestors is the metaphor of the chain of freedom. Because the chain of freedom stretches back from my ancestors and forward towards all of my descendants. So I don't have to imagine that I'm the entire chain of freedom. I have to just make sure that the chain of freedom doesn't break at my link, that I don't give in to despair, that I always maintain hope, that I always believe in the possibility of change, and that if I bring my imperfect self to this wonderful cause of the survival of my people and the planet and everybody on it, then that feels very inspirational to me. That feels very hopeful to me, because I know my ancestors are prepared me for this, and my descendants will be proud of me because I did not break the chain at my link. And so that's the received wisdom of my ancestors that gives me strength. But hope is an intentional practice, because our job is to look at the harm people do to each other. We look at the vomit of the world. So it's very easy to fall in despair unless you are intentional about keeping perspective, keeping balance. My more colloquial way of saying is that I party as hard as I work, because I have a toggle switch that I can turn my consciousness off when I need to watch a football game without doing a critical feminist analysis of beefy men attacking each other. I don't have to do it that way. And so those are some of the ways that I keep myself going after 53 years.
Thank you. Would you like to come up? Come on up. Come on up. All right, let's encourage her. You'd be out of breath.
First of all, thank you so much for what you were saying today. It really resonated with me, and I'm sure a lot of other folks in this space. One thing that really stuck out to me is the conversation around how the more time we spend doing this work, the younger the workforce becomes, and the more the workforce demographic changes, the more, sorry, I'm really nervous up here, the more radical the spaces that we operate in become. So I think that this is a really, really important conversation, and I think that there's probably a lot of decision makers, so-called decision makers in this space. So I'm just curious about, as these spaces become more radical and as we start to try to radicalize the nonprofit industrial complex more, how can we have conversations, or how can we start to think about conversations about challenging hierarchies in a sector that's really steeped in hierarchy?
My social justice activism when I was 16 and tear gassed at my first demonstration. And what I've learned, first of all, is that change doesn't happen on the timeline I want. It just doesn't. It happens on the speed of human trust and development. And that people aren't going to move in any faster than the trust that they build with each other. And so I caution people wanting that more radical consciousness at their workplaces to not define the people that they have to work with as the enemy. First of all, because y'all got real enemies out here, so that's just poor threat assessment. But to really see each other as on different learning curves with each other and stuff. And also recognizing that just because something is radical doesn't make it right. You know, when my first job in the movement was at the DC Rape Crisis Center, the first one in the country, and we just celebrated our 50th anniversary last night. And we operated as a collective. Everybody got paid exactly the same because we wanted to do away with hierarchy and, you know, structured information hoarding and decision making and all of that. It was a wonderful theoretical model that was wildly impractical. And we had to realize that some of us had to stay up all night worrying about how other people were going to get paid, while other people got to sleep at night. You know, and some of us had to deal with the police and the hospitals that weren't treating rape victims well. So we'd be up all times of night and day dealing with that, while others can say, well, I know I get to clock out at 5 o'clock because I got a kid to take care of. And so all of our attempt to establish and do away with hierarchy wasn't actually realistic. I find that in many workplaces, people are demanding responsibilities that they haven't even trained themselves to assume. You know, I've had people tell me, well, I want to make budgetary decisions. I said, okay, what's your budget? What's your training in preparing a budget? And they look at me like I'm asking an appropriate question or something. Like, really? You know, really? Okay, I want to be the boss. Have you managed boards of directors in the past? Have you even been on a board of directors in the past? And they look like me like, that's an appropriate question. And so we need to give people respect, but be honest with them. And part of the problem as a manager is that we are trained sometimes into dishonesty instead of just bluntly telling a person, I see where you like to go with your expectation. Let me help you get there. As opposed to saying, yes, you can have this title because you're putting all this pressure on me. And then we're promoting ill-prepared people to these jobs and then watching them fail. And then we can just say, oh, we tried, you know? So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a very complicated question you ask. That's why, you know, sometimes outside consultants and stuff have to come in to do an organizational audit to really figure out what's going on.
Thank you. So we have time for one last question. Oh, and it arrived. Great. This is a virtual question. It's not from me. Homelessness is a clear disability, less than a definition, which is being challenged. Any wisdom on the offering? Okay. Sorry, I'm having trouble reading the writing a little bit. Othering.
Go on. Maybe there was more to the question.
Houselessness, because maybe I need to read it again. Houselessness is a clear disability, less than definition, which is challenged. Any wisdom on the othering?
They're saying helplessness is a disability?
Houselessness. So
houselessness is a disability. I've never heard that framing before because that kind of frames it as an individualized issue. I find that houselessness is a structural issue, not an individual issue. like a disability is. But in the disability justice movement, we don't talk about individual disabilities. We talk about the disabling environment in which people with differing abilities have to manage. And I think that we need to talk about the anti-housing environment in which people with different access to housing and homing resources have to manage. I don't think it's like, yeah, it's, you don't have a home, so you got a disability and it's your problem kind of approach. I think it's that we all have different access to housing based on identity, vulnerabilities, all kinds of things. I also find that homelessness, being unhoused, is often a learned behavior that is reflected in what has happened to the person in the past. Because I used to have this classic, let's solve homelessness by giving people a place to stay, and making sure they can pay for it and all that other stuff. And then I slowly learned that if they haven't decolonized their minds of the things that caused them to be homeless in the first place, they'll sabotage the place you just got them. I've seen it happen too often because they'll recreate the situations that made them live precariously in the first place. And so, but describing homelessness or being unhoused or houselessness as a disability, I think I would have problem individuating that and not looking at it as an overall structural problem in a society not designed to provide and ensure people have the human right to housing.
Well, Dr. Ross, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to share your wisdom, to answer the questions. I assure you, my kids remind me daily that I am not woke at all. But let's give a round of applause for Dr. Loretta Ross.
Thank y'all for having me.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Dr. Ross. A lot to think about, and as we are moving into, I think, a period where there's going to be, we have to be fighting for the right to housing, and we'll be facing people that are challenged with encampments and other parts of the dealing with more visible homelessness and organized opposition to our work. I think the advice and the wisdom of Dr. Ross is well placed and very helpful. So thank you all very much. Your concurrent sessions will start at 10 o'clock. So thank you all. Have a great morning. We'll see you here at lunch.